What's up, guys? Welcome to iRace's Garage. Today, we're going to take one of those guitars that you saw from my last video. We're going to go downstairs and we're going to fix all of those playability issues that I identified last time. So let's go. What's up, guys? Welcome back to the garage. If this is your first time here, this video probably won't make a lot of sense. This is kind of a follow-up to the last video I did where I compared 4 identical guitars to see what kind of quality control issues you might expect when you're buying that particular budget-based guitar. If you haven't seen that video, go on back, take a look at that one first. I'll put a link below. So now that we know what these guitars need to make them great players, I'm going to take one of these, we're going to bring it down to the bench, and I'm going to show you step by step what it takes to take care of all those issues. Specifically, we're going to focus on 3 key areas. The first 2 definitely relate to playability, with the most important being reworking this nut. Like you may have seen in my last video, this nut is not cut very well at all. I didn't really realize how badly it was cut until I went through and did the first one. Not only was I able to bring the slot height down for better intonation, but now it tunes up beautifully. Those tuners don't feel gritty at all. It stays in tune and it just makes it a joy to play. The next big area that we want to address are the frets and the fretboard. Like I'd mentioned in my last video, these frets were extremely gritty. They were so gritty that the first time I played the guitar, the string actually folded underneath my finger when I tried to do a bend. So the goal there is to use a file. We'll get those fret ends feeling a lot better. Then we're going to polish the frets and just make it play nice and smooth. And then, unlike what I would usually do where I cover the fretboard during that process, this time I actually left the fretboard wide open, and I did basically the same thing to the fretboard. I sanded the fretboard and then I even polished it along with the frets. You can see here this fretboard is substantially darker and it doesn't have that dry, crusty, chalky feel anymore. Now it really looks and feels like a premium piece of rosewood, and I like how it feels when I play it now. Between that and the frets, it just made the world of difference. Now, like I mentioned, the setup was already really good. All I had to do was make a couple of minor tweaks to accommodate the different strings. Based on my measurements, these strings were a 9-46. I went with a more standard 10-46 on these, so we had to make a couple of minor tweaks. Lastly, even though it doesn't affect playability, one other area that I wanted to address was the cosmetics. Now, I didn't go crazy on this. Certain things are just not worth fixing, especially if they're under the finish and so forth. But we were able to hit some of the easier things, some of the dull spots and so forth we were able to clean up. In particular in this one, I was able to clean some of that black paint out of the F-holes, things like that, just to make it look a little bit nicer. So I've already got one down on the bench. Let's get down there. That's where this video is really going to take place. All right, so here we are down on the bench, and one note I want to make right away is if you're going to do this, don't get rid of the original strings. What we're going to be doing with filing this nut may end up actually damaging the strings, so you don't want to use your new strings. I'm a dumbass and took the old strings off, so I had to grab a spare set of strings, but learn from me. So anyway, what I want to do first is get the string height in the nut to the proper location. Now, this was one of the guitars where it wasn't too bad to begin with. So what we want to do is have just an ever so slight gap, if any, at the first fret when we're fretting on the far side of the second. This one's honestly not bad compared to some of the others, but the A has to come down, the G could come down, or the D could come down, the G could come down, the B can come down, and the E. So really the low E is the only one that was worth a damn. So what we're going to do is one at a time. We're going to back off here, and we're going to take our fret files, and we're going to aim the fret file toward the spot where the string is going to go into the tuner. We're going to start at an angle, and we're going to work this back and forth Now, like I said, I don't have to take much off on this one, so this is really just to smooth things out. And then we kind of work our way flat. Now we can put this back in and tune to pitch or close to it. You don't have to be exactly on, but you don't want it too loose either, or it'll give you a false sense. Okay, so now the E is in good shape, so now we can move on. Now this one I recall having been higher. Yeah, so we got a little bit more work to do on this one. So unfortunately, this is not one of the areas where you can get by with common hand tools. You really do need a set of nut files to do this job. Some guys will try like the welding tip cleaners. Some guys will put a serrated edge on a set of feeler gauges, and those may work to some extent, but not well enough. The feeler gauges, actually, it's not a bad idea. It'll cut. It'll get you down to the height you need, but you're not going to get the rounded edge in the bottom of your slot like you'll get from a set of these Music Nomad files, which is exactly why I went with these to begin with, and they leave a great nut slot. Now, these Music Nomad files aren't super cheap. They're like $100, and I know a lot of folks don't want to pay that, but if you're going to dabble in cheap guitars, they're all going to need the nut worked on. It's just the fact. So if you're not going to dabble in cheap guitars on a regular basis, and maybe this IYV is the only one that you were considering, then I would say take it to a luthier or a trusted guitar tech and have them do this. It'll cost less than a set of these files if you have them do it once. If you're ever planning on buying another cheap guitar, then get yourself a set of these files. I use them on almost every guitar I work on. And to be honest, especially with cheap guitars, you won't believe how much money you'll save on tuners once you start filing the nuts. So I'm going to finish up the rest of these, then we'll come back. All right, so now we've been through all of the 6 slots, and I think we were at about 10 or 12 thousandths when I started. I don't really remember. I just know that it was fairly high, and that was the low E that I measured. This got progressively worse as we went to the smaller string gauges. Now I'm using a 4 thousandths feeler gauge, and I get it just right. I can feel it get through maybe with a little bit of drag. So now we're like at that 3 to 5 thousandths range. If you fret each of these individual notes at the first fret, they're exactly a half a step higher. It doesn't go sharp like it used to. So that's mission accomplished. So you could really stop here, but frankly, this nut is really ugly and it sits very high above where the string sits. So I want to take this down until we're at about the height of the strings. And that's really why you want to keep your old strings on here. So what I'm going to do now is put some tape down just to help protect things, and we're going to start sanding until we get basically to the height of the strings. So you can't really damage anything anyway because you do have the strings here protecting it, but just for the hell of it, I put some tape. Now I'm going to use some 100 grit sandpaper, and I'm just going to get sanding basically until I'm down to the strings. So now we're down where we're basically just starting to kiss the strings, and now that we're at this point, one thing you want to do is carefully just start to radius the nut to the sides like this. This is going to make it a lot smoother if you run into it with your hand when you're running up and down the fretboard. And what we're going to do after is knock the corners off of it just like we do with the frets, and that'll really make it feel nice. But now we have a situation where our strings are barely beneath the surface of that nut, and that way it's going to make it a lot easier to get the strings in and out of it when you need to, and it's just going to look a whole lot better too. So now we can get this stuff off and we can get the strings off, and then we're going to start working our way up in sandpaper. So let's do that.
All right, so the strings are off now, and I put some tape down, and I even taped down a piece of cardboard just in case I happen to sand into some of this. Now, we already got the basic shape of the nut down, but before we move up and grit, I just want to kind of round this edge over and taper it up to the area where the strings come off of it. So we'll start here and round our way up. Alright, so that's feeling pretty good, and you can see I already wore through some tape into that cardboard, which is why I put the cardboard there. I also turned around the truss rod cover just as a little extra insurance. And the reason I'm going through all these steps is because when I did my own personal guitar, yeah, I kind of went through and had to repolish it. So now we're going to step up to a 100 grit, and now we can really start moving by hand, because we're not really looking to take more material off now. Now we're really looking to just smooth it out so that we end up with a nicer finish. Now, one thing you don't want to do, you don't want to sand on the edge toward the fretboard, because that's the point where the string comes off, and if you file that back in any way, then you're going to start affecting intonation. So we really want to stay away from that part. Now, like I mentioned before, we want to round these edges off just like we do with our frets, and this is actually one of my files that I use to file frets. And I'm going to use the exact same process that I would to file over a fret end. And you can really taper that as much as you want. You just don't want to taper it to the point where you get to that string slot. But anything from that string slot toward the edge of the fretboard is fair game. And now that feels nice and smooth. So now what we're going to do is just keep moving up on the sandpaper. We're going to move up to a 240, and then we'll just keep moving on up. Now, I'm not going to go too much farther at this point, because we're going to be using these same grits when we do the fretboard and the frets, so I can just use those on the nut at the same time. So we're only going to take this up to about a 320 right now. Alright, so now we're up through 320, which is enough for now. Now what we want to do is shift our focus toward the fretboard. Now, before we get started on that, we're going to do more taping. And this may end up being off camera, but all I'm going to do is use more of my tape to cover up the neck humbucker. And we're going to cover up the areas adjacent to the side of the fretboard. And again, this is just so that if we bump into something with our files, we don't cause damage. So one thing I want to point out are my fret files. And the one I use the most is this Hosco. And this was not an inexpensive file. I think it was around 45 or 50 bucks. And I use it because I like it. But I did a lot of guitars before I had that file. And this is my needle file, which just came from this extremely cheap needle file set that I got at Harbor Freight. And what you want are the ones that are flat with a flat side. And I've got 3 or 4 of those in here. And I've probably done 50 guitars with just this one, and it's still working great. So there's a lot of guitars you can do with just a cheap $5 set of needle files. Now, the only thing you need to make sure of is this edge here. I ground it down on a bench grinder, and the same with this side. And that's absolutely necessary because we're going to be putting this down right on our fretboard, and we're going to be working those frets. So it's very, very important that this is not sharp and it's not abrasive at all, so that it won't dig into your fretboard. That's the beauty of these Hosco files, is that they come already with a flat side, so when you put it down and do your work, you're not going to damage your fretboard. But these cheap $5 needle files work just as well once you take that narrow edge off. Now, to do these, you're just going to put our hand here. We're going to get up against that fret, and we're going to push with a little bit of a curling motion. And as I curl, I'm also going to roll the file over. So we have that sort of a motion. And then we do the same thing on this side. And if you have a fret sticking out, you can use the same file and just take it down until it's even with the fretboard. But essentially, we're just going to do that 47 more times, up and down both sides of the neck, and then we're going to be ready for our next step. So I'm going to go ahead and get all the rest of these done. So all 48 fret ends are done now. So now what we're going to do is start sanding. So typically I would probably start this process with about a 400 or a 600 grit, but these frets feel pretty lousy, so I'm going with the 320. Now usually I would go right to the frets, but I'm going to start with the fretboard. What you want to do is make sure that you get right up to the edge of things. Sometimes you got to even get your nail in there. That way everything gets sanded evenly. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to get right at those edges, and then I'm going to come back and we'll start on the frets. So now we've got that whole fretboard sanded with the 320. Now I'm going to pay more attention to the edges and the edges of the frets. And this is part of the reason why I started with the 320, because during my review I noticed that the edge of this fretboard is a little bit sharp. It had been rolled a little bit, but I like the feel of a nicely rolled fretboard. And so what you can do is use this 320 and pretty aggressively push on it, just like this, and then go right over the edges of the frets too. And you can go up and down the whole fretboard. And then what I want to do is go the other way, just like this. And what this is going to do is really finish rounding off the edges of those frets. And now those frets are going to be in absolutely fantastic shape. And then once we get done doing it this way, I want to go back on the frets and go in line with the fret, so that any remaining marks or scratches are going to be perpendicular to your strings, so that when you do bends and so forth, they're still going to feel great. So this is 320. We're going to do this again with 600, 800, 1000, 1500. Then we're going to move over to the micro meshes, and we're going to keep working our way up. So I'll come back when I'm getting near the end of those micro meshes. So now we've been through all the different sandpapers. We started with the 320, then we worked to 600, then we did 800, 1000, 1500, and 2000. And now we're going through the exact same process with the micro mesh. And for the micro mesh, we're starting with this 15 micron. Then we're going to go back to the 9, then down to 3, 2, and 1. So as you can see, we did the edges of the frets. Now we do on the top. Now we're going to go through making sure that we get the fretboard and the frets. And we just keep working our way through all these grits. And I will be back once we're done. And then we're going to move on to the polish. Alright, so here's where it really starts to get good. This is where we're going to take our chrome polish. So I'm just using this Mother's chrome and aluminum polish. To be perfectly honest, it doesn't really matter what you use. Semi-chrome, Meguiar's, anything from the automotive section will do. They're all pretty much the same. It's just a mild abrasive. So we're going to get plenty of that on the nut too. Now I'm going to take the old trusty drill. I've got a foam pad on it, and we're going to go to town. And you can see already that it's just got a nice luster to it. So I'm going to go ahead and do the rest of the board, then we'll move on. So now we're done with the polish. The fretboard feels great. And the next thing we're going to do now is go through my normal routine of using the lemon oil followed by the Howard's Feed and Wax. Now a lot of folks use lemon oil, and it really does give a nice look, and you'll see right away how it seems to darken the fretboard even more. Gives it a great look. Problem is this pretty much flashes off right away and doesn't leave it looking really nice like this. You'll only get, I don't know, a day or two, and then it goes back to looking the way it did. So what I like to do is put the feed and wax over it, and it kind of locks in this look, and it makes it stay this way for a very long time. Plus the wax on the wood gives it even more of that nice smooth feel, and it keeps it feeling smooth for a long time too. Now we come in with the Howard's. Put a little bit down, and you treat this just like a car wax. You put it down, you rub it around, and then you wait for it to dry up, and then you polish it off. So we're going to do this. It's going to take a while for it to dry. It definitely seems to take longer than a car wax to dry. I would say it's a good half an hour or more. So we're going to leave that be, and then when I come back, we're going to start addressing some of the cosmetics. So now we've got the wax off of this, and you can see that the fretboard really is starting to look very nice. I don't think it's quite as dark as the other one that I've done so far, but overall it feels great. The frets feel great. The nut, even though it's pretty discolored, which I guess is just something you need to live with certain pieces of bone, is nicely polished and should really have great tuning stability. Now, in terms of cosmetics, this one didn't really seem too bad. The only real issues I saw was a little bit of black right here, and then we had a few areas that need to be polished better. In the horn up here is dull, and then on the back side, right along this edge is dull, and there's a spot right along the neck that doesn't look great. So those are just going to need a little bit of buff out, and this guy's going to be done. Now, luckily, there's no sanding scratches on this one, so rather than use a more abrasive rubbing compound, I can just use this swirl remover, which is a good thing because I need to order more rubbing compound. Now, if you have something like this set up here, which is my preferred setup for working on guitars, you need to be very, very careful because it is not difficult to really do some damage with something like this. Hold it for too long in one spot, it gets hot, and it can burn through some edges. It can just create more harm than good. So what I would recommend if you're not familiar with how to buff with one of these guys is just do it on a rag. It takes a lot more elbow grease, but it's a lot safer. But I do this regularly, so it's something I'm familiar with and quite comfortable doing. So we're going to put a little bit of our swirl remover down, spread it around. Once we're done, we give it a try. See how it looks. Looks like it's still got some more to go. And rinse and repeat. So I'll be back once I've got that done, and we'll see where we're going to go from there. All right, so now we've got the dull spots sanded out, and they're looking a whole lot better. So now what I want to do is just use an automotive car polish and go over the whole body, front and back. This will just take care of those last little couple of marks, and this will give a nice, shiny, durable finish, just like it would do for your car. And that's why I like using the automotive car wax, because it really does a great job of helping to protect the finish and just keeping it nice and smooth and shiny. After all, especially with a guitar like this is a polyurethane finish just like your car has, so any automotive products will work great. So we're just going to go ahead and apply this, then we'll let it dry like you normally would. We'll come back, we'll polish it off. Then after that, it's just time to put the new strings on it and do the final setup. Now, because this was set up so well out of the box, the overall setup process should go really quickly and shouldn't take a lot of time. But because this is a different string gauge that I'll be using, I will have to check my neck relief and my action as well as the intonation. And in all likelihood, all three will need some sort of minor adjustment. So let's get this done. All right, so now we're back. Take the wax off, and what we should have is a really nice looking guitar. Now, not all of the cosmetic issues have been taken care of. I mean, obviously, the poor scraping on the binding and the little black paint speck underneath here. I mean, you can't get rid of everything, but those things that you can take care of still makes a difference. So now we've got a nice looking guitar, and we're ready to go ahead and put strings on. All right, so now we're all strung up and we're tuned to pitch, and now we have to go through and double check our setup. Even though this had a good setup before, now that I'm using a different string gauge, my expectation is that it's going to need a little bit of tweak. And looking at the relief, I'm not going to measure it, but I can tell that it's got a little bit more relief in the neck than I want. So first thing we're going to do is go ahead and slack off some strings, and we're going to go ahead and tighten up the truss rod. All right, so that took a ton of tweaking, but once I figured out that this is actually a double acting truss rod, it helped me to figure out what I was doing a little bit better. And now we've got it dialed in, and I'm at right about 9 or 10 thousandths of relief, which is where I like it. Now that the relief is set, we can check our action at the 12th fret. About 4.5 64ths on the bass, just a hair over 4 64ths on the treble. So since I like my action just a hair lower, I'm going to release the tension on these strings, and then we're going to back off on the bridge just a little bit. So I was tuning this to pitch, and I had a high E snap right at the tuner, and I actually had the exact same problem with the original set of strings on the same guitar. So that tells me that there's some sort of a burr on the tuner that's causing the string to fatigue. So now we're going to take care of that. I don't want this guitar going to someone and having this problem again. So after I got that high E tuner filed, I also took the Dremel just to smooth it out a little bit more, got it put back on, got it tuned to pitch, had to make a minor tweak to the intonation like I expected, but now we're in good shape, and all I need to do is put the truss rod cover back on, and this guy's all done.
So there you go. Now you know exactly what it takes to transform a very low budget guitar into a great guitar. And it doesn't even cost anything, it just takes a little bit of time and knowledge. So if you're thinking about getting one of these from Amazon, or you've already got one, now you know exactly what it'll take to make that transformation. So if you watched this video and you decided that maybe some of that work isn't in your wheelhouse, but you still wanted to try one of these guitars, check in the link below, because I've got 4 of these. I'm keeping one for myself, but the other 3 I'm doing these upgrades to, and I'm going to sell via Facebook Marketplace. I can't guarantee that I'll still have any left when you're seeing this video, but if I do, you'll see those links below. Well, anyway, guys, I really hope this was helpful. If it was, make sure you like the video, maybe leave me a comment below, and I always appreciate your subscription. It really helps to get these videos out and in front of more people, which can only help this channel grow. So anyway, guys, thanks a lot. We'll see you next time.